Cannibalism is often called the ultimate taboo, and the horror genre is known for exploring the forbidden. Horror films in particular have a long history with the subject, with entire subgenres forming around it. Even when it's a step removed, be it zombies, vampires, or werewolves, there have always been explorations of devouring flesh. In recent years there's been a change, however, with protagonists rather than antagonists exploring their desires and engaging in a taste of long pork. Jumping a few decades, there are two diverging paths. The first begins in Italy with Man from Deep River, or Sacrifice, as it was released in the US. Said to be the progenitor of the Italian cannibal boom, although it would take 5 years for others of the genre to be released. In it, a white man is kidnapped by a tribe of native people who are at war with another more primitive cannibal tribe. Eventually the protagonist grows to understand the culture and decides to stay with them, helping to fight against the vicious cannibals. It was noted for its extreme violence, including torture, which would become a mainstay of the subgenre. It's also notable for including images of animals being killed, which is unfortunately also a large part of it. Starting from 1977, there would be a dozen or so films released in a 5-year period, including the infamous Cannibal Holocaust. In all of these, the cannibals are the native inhabitants of a jungle, and generally depicted as almost inhuman. On the other side of the Pacific in 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released. It's about a group of kids being terrorized by a family of killers called the Sawyers. While the cannibalism is merely implied in the original, it's confirmed in the sequel, and plays a large part in most of the 9 films. The film uses cannibalism as a metaphor for capitalism, the devastation caused by the meat industry, and, just a bit, the treatment of veterans from the Vietnam War. After Chainsaw became a huge success, there were a large number of imitators. The biggest name was Wes Craven's attempts with The Hills Have Eyes, featuring a family deformed by radiation. Others include Motel Hell, Wrong Turn, and Ravenous. Ultimately, however, the imitators and sequels had much less success than the original, and cannibalism became a much rarer sight in horror. In the last decade or so, however, there has been a change. Instead of featuring cannibals as tribes of native people, crazed hillbillies, or ferocious monsters, they've been protagonists, heroes of their own story just trying to survive in whatever way they can. Somos La Calle is a Mexican film released in 2010, but we'll be looking at the American remake released in 2013, As We Are What We Are. There are a large number of differences between the two films, with diverging plots, characters, and themes. The only real similarity is the titles, and the fact that they both feature cannibalism. The film focuses on the Parker family, with the patriarch Frank, his wife Emma, their daughters Iris and Rose, and the youngest son, Rory. At the beginning of the film, Emma dies suddenly, and it's up to the rest of the family to deal with the fallout, which is especially difficult, as they are only a few days out from their yearly ritual. That ritual involving killing a woman that has been kidnapped, cutting her up, and serving her a stew. Prior to this, the whole family fasts, so they can get the full enjoyment out of it. The practice started in the 1700s when the original settlers were starving in the winter and were forced to eat their relatives. The film treats the act of cannibalism as a ritual practice. In some ways, it's an extension of transubstantiation, the Catholic act of drinking the blood and eating the body of Christ. The flesh is, however, not eaten raw. There's a cookbook with explicit instructions for how the body is meant to be served. They draw on the corpse with lipstick, a traditionally feminine ornament, dividing it into different cuts, just like a butcher. The film is a more traditional villain in the form of their father, who is abusive and eventually violent. Despite this, there is still an emphasis on the coming-of-age elements, especially with the eldest daughter, Iris. Due to her mother's death, she is forced to step up, taking on larger responsibilities for the home, including the emotional burden of both her father and her brother. In addition, she is dealing with a boy that she has a clear attraction to, but, due to her upbringing and responsibilities, she finds herself unable to commit to the relationship. When she finally does, it has deadly consequences. In effect, the film is about the pressures put on by cultural and religious upbringing, especially on young women. It's also about a sense of identity, how despite isolation and an overbearing father, the children are able to form a unique sense of self. While initially they perform the ritual, killing the captive woman and cutting her up, at the end of the film, this is turned on its head. Throughout the film, the town's doctor has been investigating a bone that he found. He also did the autopsy on Emma, initially believing she suffered from Parkinson's, but he later realizes she had Kuru, a disease caused from eating human brains. With this knowledge, he realizes the Parker family has killed his missing daughter from a decade ago, and he goes to confront them. Mr. Parker learns about this and decides to end it all, poisoning their meals with arsenic. Just before the family eats it, however, the doctor arrives, and there is a violent confrontation. In the end, the doctor and a friendly neighbor are killed, and it seems like all hope is lost. However, that's when the two daughters, Rose and Iris, overpower their weakened father, pinning him to the table and biting into him. They devour large chunks out of him, and eventually he dies. They've reclaimed their power by transforming the act of cannibalism from a ritual of devouring a woman to a vengeful attack on the patriarchal representative. All the films I'm going to discuss in this video have female leads, while traditionally cannibals were male villains. Some were even defined by their lack of feminine influence, like the Sawyer family in Chainsaw. In those cases, the traditional act of creating a meal was done by males, changing it from creation to destruction. However, those ideas are ultimately antiquated, and modern films have taken the idea and turned it around. In Raw, a 2016 film by Julia Ducournau, it also follows a pair of sisters. In this case, however, their circumstances couldn't be more different. Justine is just starting her freshman year at a veterinarian college that her rebellious older sister, Alexia, also attends. The film is part of the New French Exterminate movement, a range of transgressive films made over the last 2 decades, which featured extremely graphic content, typically involving gore and sexual imagery. Other examples include a Serbian film and Antichrist. The film focuses on Justine exploring a new world, one full of sex, excess, and gluttony. She's been raised a vegetarian, but as part of an elaborate hazing ritual, is forced to eat rabbit liver. While initially her body rejects it, including developing hives, she starts to have an immense desire for meat. Not human, though. Not yet, at least. For the first half of the film, it's a fairly standard coming-of-age story. Justine becomes attracted to her roommate, but unfortunately for her, he's gay. Well, that's what he says. Eventually it's revealed that he's bisexual. She deals with teachers who dislike her, abusive upperclassmen, and the difficulties of moving into a new place. At right around the halfway point, she is bonding with her sister when there's an accident, and her sister's finger gets cut off. While Justine is initially frightened, she very quickly chomps down on the finger, devouring it like it's a chicken wing. While her sister is briefly unconscious, she wakes up to that grisly sight. Cut to the next day, and her sister has been treated at the hospital. The missing finger is blamed on a dog, and Alexia reveals that she is also a cannibal, causing a car accident and offering the injured driver as a meal to Justine. This was foreshadowed a few times throughout the film, with various accidents in the background. In Raw, cannibalism is linked to intense emotions, oftentimes sexual. She goes to a paint party and starts getting hot and heavy with a guy before biting him on the lip. A similar scene can be found in May, where the inexperienced protagonist attempts it as a form of flirting inspired by a horror film. Her next encounter is when she begins to have sex with her roommate. While she attempts to bite him, he is able to overpower her, and eventually she ends up munching down on her own arm. Self-cannibalism is much rarer than other kinds, but with the metaphor of sexual awakening, it makes some sense. However, while their first encounter works out well, the next does not. At the end of the film, Justine and Alexia share in a dish, with the roommate ultimately killed, or at least paralyzed by a stab to the spine, while they subsequently devour parts of him. This is not shown, somewhat of a subversion for the genre, although the results are. Cannibalism serves a number of different functions in Raw. Sometimes it's an expression of sexuality, sometimes rebellion, and other times addiction. At one point, Alexia taunts Justine with a dead body, holding it just out of reach while she's drunk, in a video that's subsequently posted on social media. Similarly, in the end, they go too far in their addiction and hurt someone close to them. In the final scene, it's revealed that cannibalism is not only exclusive to the 2 sisters, but their mother as well. Her father shows a heavily scarred torso, implying that he's been their mother's willing victim for decades. It's a strong finish for the film, and helps to emphasize the themes. It adds on to the idea that the bond that is shared in the film is not just between 2 sisters, but spans generations. Furthermore, it pushes the idea that throughout the film, it is almost always women eating men. While Justine's introduction to cannibalism was an accidental offering, after that it was exclusively men she fed on, which is also the gender she's attracted to, furthering the connection between sex and cannibalism. That link is also prevalent in the most recent entry in the subgenre, Bones et al. While the film is based on a 2015 book, it was released in 2022. In it, we follow Marin, a young woman who just turned 18. She sneaks out to go to a slumber party, but while there she eats her friend's finger, before running back to her father. He reveals they've been doing this for years, but eventually he has enough and leaves her with a birth certificate, a bit of cash, and a last message. Marin immediately decides to pursue her birth mother, who she never knew, and hops on a bus. While traveling, she encounters another cannibal named Sully, who offers her shelter and a bite to eat. In this universe, cannibals have a supernatural ability to identify others like them, called eaters, and even people who are close to death. While initially she is wary of Sully, he is able to reassure her that he doesn't mean any harm, at least for a little while. Cannibalism here is not necessarily a specific thing, but instead a catch-all for any sort of characteristic that makes someone different. It could be viewed as a queer allegory, a religious one, or racial. It works for however you want to interpret it. Soon Marin stumbles into another kind of movie, however, as she discovers another cannibal, Lee, and quickly buddies up with him. The pair travel around the country, eating people ethically and slowly bonding. Finally, Maren reaches her mother's birthplace and has a brief chat with her grandmother. She learns that her mother is also a cannibal, again passed down maternal lines. When Maren visits her mother in the insane asylum, she discovers that she has eaten her own hands in an attempt to curb her hunger. Again, we have self-cannibalism, but this time intended to stop the hunger rather than to continue it. Before she did that, however, she wrote a letter to her daughter, hoping that one day she would be sought out. After the reveal of the letter, however, she tries to kill Maren in an attempt to save her from the curse. It's a particularly harrowing scene, showcasing elements of self-hatred, familial pressures, and the potential damage caused by suppression. Immediately after, Maren runs away from Lee, afraid that she's going to become just like her mother and hurt him. While this is not an overt act of aggression, like her mother did, it is taking the choice away from Lee, and continuing a cycle of abandonment. So Lee then reveals himself again, having followed Maren since they first met. While this is creepy, he ultimately respects her decision. Kind of. After some soul-searching, Maren realizes her own power and choices, and seeks out Lee again. The two have a tearful reunion, and decide to live a straight life, with a job, an apartment, and other normal things. Unfortunately, there will always be people who fight against this, and in this case, slowly reappears for final time, exhibits some xenomorph traits before attacking Lee and Maren. While they ultimately slay the villain, Lee is fatally wounded. His final wish is to be eaten, bones and all. Maren is initially resistant, but finally embraces herself. In all of these films, cannibalism is a form of self-actualization, taking control of one's destiny, while ironically embracing an all-devouring hunger. This is completely different from how it was treated before, as a horrible villainous trait that was almost exclusive to men and used to show their debauchery. This implies a shift in culture, a desire to explore different ideas in horror and film in general. Despite this, however, there still seems to be a resistance to it for the general movie-going audience. While Rotten Tomatoes is not the most accurate gauge of the film's quality, it's notable that all three films have an audience score at least 20% worse than the critics. It's clear that while some are willing to engage with the fantasy, many are unwilling or unable to see a cannibal as a protagonist. Horror films are inherently moralistic, and having a protagonist engage in acts that can be considered evil will inherently have many opposed to it. Cannibalism can, just like any other theme in horror, be used to represent a lot of different things. It's allegorical, but what it's used to discuss is varied. In We Are What We Are, it represents religious and familial pressure. In Raw, it's sexual liberation, and in Bones and All, it's just being different. I look forward to seeing the next entries in the burgeoning subgenre, as I'm sure their ideas will be similarly unique. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if there are any similar cannibal films I missed, or just your general thoughts. Be well.